Welcome to Between Two Chairs, Demystifying Commercial Real Estate, the podcast that brings you the latest insights and trends on the South Florida commercial real estate market, with your hosts, Fernando Arencibia Jr. and Jennifer Woolman. In each episode, we dive into the world of commercial real estate and break down complex concepts to make them accessible for everyone. Whether you're a real estate professional, a curious investor, or just interested in the South Florida market in general, Between Two Chairs is the podcast for you. So pull up a chair and join us.
Welcome, everybody, to another person. Yes, welcome to another person. All right, my apologies. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Between Two Chairs. My name is Fernando Arencibia, and with me is the very personable Jennifer Woolman. Hi, Jennifer. Say hi.
Hi, I guess I'm the other person.
Oh, yes, you are. So, Jennifer, we are actually going to discuss a very timely topic. You know, we were looking in social media, and we saw a post from Ryan Serhant about a $50 million deal that was falling apart because the seller at the last minute goes into ChatGPT and basically asks ChatGPT, am I selling at the right price? ChatGPT told it that it was selling at a very low price, that he should not sell. I think the question was, should I sell at this price? At the same time, the buyer went to ChatGPT and asked, should I buy at this price? And ChatGPT said, no, you're buying too high. You're paying too high of a price. And so it threw the deal into a tailspin. And it brings up the question about how good are LLMs, large language models, at evaluating a very specific acquisition and sale of a property. I thought it would be an important topic, to discuss. One of the things that has been talked about a lot is how much we, in our culture, have entered into a world in which we live in a world where our biases continue to be confirmed by the algorithm in our social media feeds. And I'm wondering if part of what we're seeing here is that the large language models are also confirming our biases rather than giving us unbiased, accurate data, which perhaps the LLMs don't have the ability to really provide on a very specific case-by-case basis.
Well, I think, and a lot of this was pointed out, what was super interesting about this post that he did, and he did two. He did the initial one, and it got a ton of comments. Yeah. And then he did the follow-up one, which also got a ton of comments. But what's interesting about this is just about everybody had experienced it, regardless of what industry they were in, not just in real estate. Some people were in marketing, other people were in different sales organizations, and the question was yes, or I guess the answer was yes. It actually, these large language models use our own assumptions and previous answers to base their answers on. And then to me, the most important part is that this is all based on, they go through the whole internet to get historical data. So they don't have current information. They don't have the insight of knowing what's coming down the future in that area to maybe make that deal worth something, worth it for the seller to sell at that price because of XYZ coming down the pike, interest rates possibly going up, inflation possibly going up, whatever it could be. So it doesn't take that into effect. And I thought that was super, super interesting. I think this post also showed how incredibly strong social media and the community has become as a sounding board, not just for AI, but pretty much for everything, because Ryan ended up using the feedback he got. And when people who knew about the deal were like, hey, if this buyer doesn't buy it, my buyer's lined up, it's approved, Yeah. So then he was able to say, look, I'm letting you know that there are people who want this deal at this price, whether you do or not. And then, it took him a little bit longer to convince the seller to come around, but he was able to give him enough information and the deal ended up coming together. But yeah, to your original question, I think how we ask the question and how we've trained the systems that we're using, we could get our own bias baked into the baked into the answer.
One of the things that I find interesting is that these large language models are capable of being very meta. In other words, meta from the point of view of thinking about thinking. In other words, thinking about how it dishes out the information. So I went to the LLM and I told it the story. So I went to ChatGPT and I told it the story that Ryan had explained. And I asked ChatGPT, could I trust you to basically give me a valuation that is accurate, that I can trust, right? And that I can count on in order to make a decision about acquiring a specific property. I thought that some of the answers that it was giving to me were, very eye-opening, because it's almost like the LLM is telling you, this is what I'm capable of, this is what I'm likely to do. And there are things that you can trust and there are things that you cannot trust. And the way that using me for evaluating one specific property is not the way to use me, which I thought was really interesting. So one of the points is the LLMs are not appraisers. They're pattern recognizers. They cannot and they don't value property like an appraiser. They predict based on patterns in data and prompts, and they say that it is heavily dependent, obviously, on the inputs that you're giving, right? Rent, cap rates, all those things, but also on what they call prompt framing, how you frame the question, because there is a sense that they want to validate your question. And oftentimes within our question, there is a bias as to what is the answer that we want to get to. So in other words, apparently, what I feel is that a lot of us lead, this is like in a court case, you're leading the witness to the answer that you're looking for, right? Because you want that recognition. Then he says, you might have the same property, but different answers.
I'm sorry. I got to stop you right there.
Please, yeah.
It's obviously a woman, not a he.
I have no problem with you. I don't have no problem with that. So she says, yeah, hey, you're absolutely right. It says, a buyer might ask, what's a fair price given risk, vacancy factor, or cap rate? A seller may ask, what's the highest defensible price based on upside and market comps, right? And the LLM is going to produce two very different valuations based on the question, because the question is not the same, and maybe the inputs are not the same. So the LLMs are very context sensitive. Another thing that I think you always talk about is about data integrity is everything, and bad data in, bad data out. So it always talks about LLM's accuracies based on the quality of the comps, the quality of the accuracy of the rent rolls, the accuracy of the cap rate assumptions, market data inputs, all those things. And it says that AI is not designed to be objective, but its objective is to be agreeable. So imagine, it wants to agree with you. It wants to agree with your proposition. So it says they're designed to be helpful, context aware, and persuasive. And I think you're going to love this. They may lean towards confirming the user's framing, not outright lying, but anchoring to your narrative. In other words, it's like when I was in college and I took the class statistics, what is the first thing that your statistics professor tells you? Statistics can be used to prove anything.
Right.
And sometimes the same stat can be used to prove opposite ends of the debate. Right. And so I thought that was really good. And another thing that and some of these is super scary. He goes, LLMs can sound confident even with weak points, which is the other part, that it really is empowering people, right? Because of the way that the information is being presented. And sometimes if you're anchoring that, presumption on the wrong information, the wrong data, or incomplete data sets, which is likely the case. And one example that you mentioned, I remember working on a deal with an agent that had not done a lot of commercial transactions. And we are at the property. They were listing the property, didn't have a lot of experience with commercial transactions. And in the property, the appraiser comes in, and I was there for the appraisal. And the appraiser asked, how much activity have you had in the property? How much interest and all that other stuff. And the agent was taken aback. Like, why is he asking that, Because it's not something that he normally would get asked from a residential appraiser. And I said, well, that's one of the things that they take into account is, what is the market for this? It's one of the points that Ryan was mentioning in the post. The LLMs are not taking into account that I have a lot of people that are competing for this asset.
Right.
And this is where the price is. And I one of the things that this gave me was to say that it doesn't allow for price discovery, right? Because it's just going by, okay, these are the trends. So you're going by lagging indicators.
Right.
And so you never really get the full picture.
Or like the time that I did the Chat GPT again for an agent who wasn't comfortable doing commercial, and it was a property near a hospital. And so just because he said, oh, I put it in ChatGPT, and I'm like, oh my gosh. So I'm like, let me see. And he did it just for curiosity. He wasn't quoting anybody or anything. He just wanted to see, and he put in some comps in the area. And I said, yeah, but they didn't look at who's buying the properties in the area, and the fact that this is a donut in where they've been buying. Right. So the obvious buyer is the hospital, and they're going to pay more to close that donut hole. Right. So, so that was interesting. But I'm like, every time an agent tells me, oh, I went on ChatGPT, I kind of cringe. The hair on the back of my neck stands up. But I mean, it is good for some stuff. It is good for stuff. Yeah. You just have to be very careful that you're not leading it. You're not leading it with the results that you want to get.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, because another thing that this interaction with the LLM told me is that this is the place where LLMs can add value. Scenario analysis. Well, what happens if rents grow by 5% versus 2%? If you want to do a sensitivity testing of the deal, what happens if I'm going to have a cap rate, compression or an expansion? If you're pulling together all the trends, risk, and opportunities, can you give me where the market is? And it's more of a decision support tool than an actual decision maker. And it says that AI is not an underwriter and cannot replace underwriting. It can only help you with stress testing your evaluation.
Well, and I think what's interesting is that in this case, and I don't remember how far off the price it was in Ryan's deal, but It's interesting that neither
I don't think he mentions a number,
doesn't,
right? Yeah.
But he just says it was a big deal. I mean, he does mention the number of the deal.
I think it's a big deal because
it was a $50 million deal.
Right, but it's a big deal because the seller is being told that he is selling for less than he should. The buyer is being told he's buying for more than he should. So now the chasm becomes...
Right. But what I'm saying is that what's interesting is both the buyer and the seller, it was almost like a panic check, right?
Right.
Because they didn't put it into ChatGPT beforehand, right? It doesn't sound like they said, oh, what should I list my price at, or what should I buy this property at? They did it after the deal was almost done, after they've made the commitments that they're going to sign, and then all of a sudden that doubt creeps in and that little bit of panic creeps in. Am I selling at the right time at the right price? Am I buying at the right time at the right price, right? Sure. And so I think that's what's really scary from that, is that if you're using ChatGPT to check with a fear or a doubt that you have, chances are that it's going to confirm that fear or that doubt.
Right.
And it takes away from your intuition and, the thing that I always say, your gut check as to whether or not you're buying right or not. And then that makes getting through the whole transaction, or whether it's a transaction or whatever it is that you're doubting or doing, it makes it that much harder, because now you have your doubt, you have something that validated your doubt. So now you're in a deeper doubt hole.
Correct.
and less likely to act and more likely to miss out on whatever it is that you felt pretty confident going into at the beginning. So I think that that's a real important personal check, that before you put something into ChatGPT, first of all, do it at the beginning, not at the end, not once you've made your decision. And once you've made your decision, if you're going to put it in, do the gut check before you put it in so that you can identify why you're asking ChatGPT. You know,
exactly.
Why aren't you asking your neighbor, your partner, your accountant, your, other people who have sold or bought in the area, your support network? Why are you asking a machine to?
Well, and it's important to know, ChatGPT was never going to tell you, I don't know.
Right. Right.
Even when ChatGPT, like, for example, I once put a link to something and it couldn't access the link. It didn't just tell me I can't access the link. It went on to give me another set of information that it thought was related to the link, even though it told me from the beginning, I can't access the link, but here's what I think you're asking, right? Because it's created to provide an output.
Right.
So it'll never tell you, ask your broker. It'll never tell you, I don't have complete information. I need more of this, unless you ask it, what are you missing to give me, those kind of things. And I found that interesting that even in this data set or this information that ChatGPT gave me, it said anything that happens in there can become an echo chamber. And that the biggest danger in the future is if everyone uses AI to justify their position, negotiations don't get easier, they get more entrenched.
Right.
So I'm sure it was very difficult for him to bring these two people and be like, hey.
Well, that's why I'm saying, because now both of them had their doubts quantified or verified by a, quote, authority, which who gave ChatGPT authority for my decision making. But I think the other thing, that could help is, to your point, if I'm a seller and I say, am I selling this too low, and I put in my data set, then it would be, give me your sources. Like a lot of stuff, like Gemini gives you the sources, right? If you do AI in Gemini, it's like, I got this from the Miami Herald, I got this from Barron's, so at least you can read the context in which that little paragraph where the words tied in with something that you put in brought it into the data set.
ChatGPT has been doing that as well, where it gives you the sources and all that stuff, but I would venture to say most people don't go that extra step to see what are you getting wrong, unless you already know it's wrong because I have a different valuation. You recognize that the context is not correct. I find it also interesting that I think part of the reason, and you alluded to at the beginning of this, of why he was able to bring everybody back to the table is because, he posted it and now it created this, they read the comments themselves.
Right. It gave them the insights.
It gave them the insights because, now it's very difficult to get someone to move out of their biases, and historically, if you have 10 pieces of data, 9 are not attacking, but let's say that they are, and I forget the word, but they're not confirming your bias of something, but one of those 10 is confirming, then you gravitate to that one piece of fact, and that's the one you're going to use because we as human beings don't like to be wrong. We don't like to think of ourselves as wrong. And one of the things that I found really, and this is, again, a quote, this is the LLM telling you, don't trust me based on what you're asking me, and understand that this is not the real use of me. It says the danger isn't that AI is wrong, is that it can be convincingly right for both sides, And so that's a crazy thing,
Yeah.
That's a really crazy thing. And so, but we live in this world, and I think that we are going to increasingly see more of these and have more of these conversations, because it can be a valuable tool for so many different things. But I think that when you get there's an aspect of this that requires that human touch, you're the walking into the shopping center or the warehouse or whatever asset class you're selling, getting a feel for the tenancy, getting a feel for the deal is something that is difficult to quantify, and it's not something that the AI would have the capability of seeing. And to your point, You know, I had a client a long time ago who says, I always love to be, like when he would buy in a block, he goes, I always love to be the middle. Because if any one of my neighbors wants to do something, they have to go through me.
Right.
They have to buy me out. And so, to your point, you know, how many times have people been, you know, the last piece in the donut hole, as you mentioned? Yeah, they're in a better position to negotiate, and there are things like that if you give all that data to ChatGPT, they're just going to evaluate just like everybody else. You know.
Right.
They're not going to take into account, well, all the other properties are owned by one entity. That entity is going to want that middle piece because otherwise it's going to be very expensive for them to build around it, you know? And so to be that connecting piece holds more value than a large language model would be able to quantify, you know? So now I do find it interesting that coinciding with this, you posted something on LinkedIn about these AI hacks. You know, so tell me a little bit about how you're using AI in going through your day-to-day in business.
So a lot of it is just stuff that I do repetitively. So like if I have repetitive, you know, if I'm posting something, or I did one which seems pretty popular for travel, right? So I used chat to create a travel bot or whatever you call them, a travel assistant. And I'm currently working on, and this was from the Beth Azor Summit that one of the speakers talked about, I'm currently creating profiles for CFOs, COOs, and CEOs to take a look at my business, how I do it, numbers, etc., and give me different perspectives, you know, from very well-known CEOs, COOs, and CFOs, just to get a perspective, see if there's something, you know, when you're in something so deep day in and day out, you often don't see, you know, maybe the bigger picture, or you don't see inefficiencies or something that could be done better. So I'm curious to see how that works. I haven't tried that one yet, but it's great for like the social media things and, you know, take this picture and write something in my voice. And so that kind of stuff is interesting just for stuff that you want to do on the fly. Like, and I had to do that because I always take pictures or have an idea to do a post at a conference, but I'm at the conference, so I don't want to do it while I'm there. And then I go back to my, you know, hotel room or back home to my office, and I start trying to write and remember everything, and it's so time consuming. So if I just have something for those times, then I slip in, you know, I have the basic script, I'll slip in the picture, or I'll slip in the quote or the idea or the thought, and then have the chat expand on it for me, so that it's tying the two together and just cutting out the time.
Yeah, it's a good coworker.
Correct.
You know, it really is, and as long as you are able to discern what's valuable and what is not valuable about the output, I think that's a very important thing. You know, I was sharing with my oldest daughter. She was telling me something about a lecture, and she was like, I just can't get into the lecture of this professor. And I told her about NotebookLM. And how, you know, a lot of people are using it to basically, if they have a recording of the lecture or a transcript of the lecture, they put it in, and then it creates these podcasts. And so it turns a 1 hour lecture into 20 minutes, and you can tell it, I want you to focus on this. I don't quite understand this topic that he was talking about, whatever it is. And it becomes conversational. And she was like, oh my God, this is scary. Like, it sounds like real people. I say, yeah, it is scary, but it is a good resource for you, because you know you no longer have to be in a position where, man, I'm zoning out and I'm missing valuable information.
Right.
You know, and that's how I first learned about NotebookLM, is through, you know, someone who told me that their child in college was using it for that purpose. And so, you know, there's definitely, you know, a lot of value, but I think that what happened and what Ryan showcased is that there's going to be some difficult conversations surrounding negotiations when it comes to ChatGPT, you know?
And I think that's where the brokers are going to bring the value and the insights, but I think they need to be ready for how do you counter that. And I think, you know, Ryan did a huge service posting this, and I mean, he got a lot of value out of it, yes, but so did the rest of us. And I think those are going to be conversations that that you're going to really have to know your numbers, know your market, know the asset class, know the parties involved, and be ready so that you're not taken off. How do you argue with ChatGPT, right?
How do you argue with ChatGPT? That's great.
So you're telling me that we could be doing this podcast on LM and on Notebook, and we don't even have to be involved, and we can do Hey Gen people. And by the way, this is us. This is real us. If you can see us on video, if you can hear our voices, our sniffles, our coughs.
No, believe me, nothing is going to take the place
My fray,
of your voice fry or whatever it is.
Fry, whatever.
Yeah, there you go. And there's nothing that is going to take the place of authenticity. So, never miss out on that. All right, guys. So how are you using AI, and what do you think of this, scenario? What concerns you the most in your own industry about how your consumer is using AI and how they're evaluating things? I think this is going to be an interesting, as we continue, there's going to be more and more conversation about the place of AI in our society, and this is just the tip of the iceberg for sure. So, all right, for Jennifer and I, we want to thank you again for pulling up a chair and joining us on this episode of Between Two Chairs.
And a huge shout out and thank you to Ryan for
Thank you Ryan Serhant for the topic. Absolutely. A fantastic topic, and great to discuss it, and an important conversation to be had for sure. All right, everybody. Say bye, Jennifer.
Bye.